This podcast is brought to you by the Islamic Center and NYU. For more information, visit our website at www.icnyu.org.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين صلى الله عليك يا سيدي يا مولاي يا رسول الله وعلى أهل بيتك المظلومين صلى الله عليك يا سيدي يا مولاي وابن مولاي يا أبا عبد الله يا رحمة الله الواسعة ويا باب نجاة الأمة يا غريب يا مظلوم يا أتشان كربلاء ما خاب من تمسك بكم ولمن من لجأ إليكم سادتي يا ليتنا كنا معكم فنفوز والله فوزا عظيما. قال الله العظيم في محكم كتابه الكريم والقول كالحق والأصدق القائلين أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا قوا أنفسكم وأهليكم نارا وقودها الناس والحجارة آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم اللهم صل على محمد. This verse that I began with in chapter 66, verse number 6 of the Holy Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to the believer as He commands us, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, O you who believe, qu anfusakum wa ahlikum nara. He says, save yourselves and save your children from eternal punishment. And other ayat of the Holy Quran, they speak to the fact that our wealth and our children are a test or a trial for us. Innama amwalukum wa awladukum fitna. The idea is that as much as our wealth, as much as our children, as much as all of the blessings that we receive are a unique blessing from Allah Azza wa Jal, at the same time, God tries us by means of the blessings that He has given us to see how we will interact with them and how we will deal with them. And like we know that there's probably not a lot of challenges in life that are similar toward raising children. In fact, if you go toward the lives of the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as God presents within the Holy Quran, we see the obstacles of Prophet Nuh alayhi salam and his son. We see the obstacles of Luqman and the interaction that he has with his children. Similarly, we consistently are witness to the fact that throughout history, there can undoubtedly be children who come from the lines of believers, but at the same time, they don't necessarily have that same conviction, nor that same belief, and also vice versa. Whereby you see children who turn out to be mu'mineen and mu'minat, staunch in their conviction of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the authority of the Messenger of God sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, but their parents may not believe. Nonetheless, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He commands us to at the very least make a sincere effort in striving to being amongst those who cultivate children, who learn from this faith and have convictions in God, in the Holy Quran, in the prophethood of our Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and of course, most importantly, live a life of morality, live a life of ethics, live a life of virtue, so on and so forth. Which is why in the famous hadith from Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen, Ali alayhi salam, he states, Min haqq al-walad ala abihi. We often talk about the rights of the parents over the children. Yet in this particular hadith, Imam Ali alayhi salam, he talks about the rights of the children over the parent, and specifically over the father. Min haqq al-walad ala abihi an yuhsina ismuh wa an yuhsina ta'limuh wa an yuzawwijuhu idha balagh. The Imam alayhi salam states, and it is from amongst the rights of the child over his father, number one, that the parent gives the child a good name, to give them a good name, to give them a name of one of the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or one of the names of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, or one of the names of those who come from the holy household of Ahlul Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them. And number two, the Imam alayhi salam, he states, وَأَنْ يُحْسِنَ تَعْلِيمُهُ. The second right of the child over the parent is that the parent teaches the child good etiquette, naturally, we strive to do the best that we can toward imparting etiquette, morality, virtue, like we spoke about before, to our children. And it's a responsibility and obligation upon the parents to do so. And thirdly, وَأَن يُزَوِّجُهُ إِذَا بَلَغَ. And thirdly, to get one's child married when they attain the ability to do so physically, when they attain age to get married. And like we know within the religion of Islam as well, there's so much a stress in regards to family building, in regards to having children. In fact, if you go ahead and take a look at our du'as, you see so many a supplication narrated from the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them, that for instance, talk about a supplication or a du'a to be recited at the moment of conceiving a child. At the moment, for instance, when the child has reached 3 months, throughout the pregnancy of the mother of that child, a supplication or ayat of the Holy Quran to be recited at the moment of delivery, and so on and so forth. Again, in the idea that a child is brought up in the environment of the Quran, in the environment of the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And thus for today's discussion, insha'Allah ta'ala, I want to reflect upon a really important question that sort of sparks up in many of our households, and specific with regards to how we speak to our children about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's easy, for instance, perhaps to impart wisdom, to impart morality, to impart values like that of compassion and generosity to our children if we ourselves uphold those same values. Of course, that itself is difficult and challenging in and of itself, but if we're a people of virtue, naturally our children, they will follow suit. But it's awfully difficult and challenging for most people to talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creation of God as the creator, to our children. Because like we know, kids, our intellects, they begin to develop once we attain the age of puberty. But prior to that, it goes through its own unique phases and obstacles and challenges and experiences. And everything that a child sees and everything that a child experiences, it's etched into their memory, which is why we will oftentimes remember certain sort of profound and formative experiences during the course of our lives, even though we might have only been 3 or 4 years old. If something really significant and important happens in our household from when we're really young, there's a good opportunity that we'll remember it 30 or 40 years down the road. And this, the idea is to create memories and to create experiences for our children, whereby they're able to grow up in the climate of the remembrance and in the knowledge and in the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So for today's discussion, insha'Allah ta'ala, I want to pose the question of how do I teach my child about God? And I want to reflect upon this question in 3 different dimensions. The first dimension is in terms of understanding the levels in terms of how children learn. Secondly, a couple of bad methods that we often employ in terms of engaging or teaching our children. And thirdly, and finally, some hopefully practical steps in terms of how we can teach our children about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So let's get into dimension number 1. And that's specifically in terms of understanding the levels whereby a child develops this ability to know, or in other words, how does a child learn? I don't claim to be a psychologist, nor a biologist, nor a neurologist. And I can't speak to the fact of how the brain develops during the early course of a child's life. But nonetheless, development of a young child, especially again during those early years, between the day of his or her birth until approximately 6 or 7 years old, there are a couple of different common themes and experiences that all children encounter and deal with. And many of these are also pointed to and referenced within the teachings and the ahadith of Muhammadin wa Ali Muhammad. And so I want to run through a couple of these different levels in terms of how a child learns in order that we're able to answer these really important and profound questions about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when they ask us. The first point to note is the fact that a child at a very young age learns via observation. Like we know, a child at a very young age is looking out for their parents' faces, looking out to see how they act or how they respond to certain things. When you get angry, a child knows that it has to be fearful. When you get happy, the child might, for instance, make the same face or might make the same sound in order to get that same reaction, because it feels the presence of his or her mother or father or uncle or aunt or friend or whoever else is in that particular household. And children, oftentimes, they listen for sounds. And again, they listen for responses. So they will start hearing their own voices, and they will start calling out when they need something, when they need to drink milk, when they need to drink water, when they need to eat food, when they wake up from their sleep. They wake up often crying because they want to demonstrate that they have a need. And the way that they recognize that their parent is going to come to their support is by making a sound. Because the minute that a child starts to cry, the minute that the child begins to scream, the parents run into the room to make sure that their child is doing okay. As that child becomes a little bit older, they start to explore and they observe by, for instance, shaking toys or playing with toys or banging them against the wall, because again, they like that sound and they want to observe slowly what happens and what takes place at the moment of their movement, and so on and so forth. So it's really important to understand that a child, especially in those very first months of life, maybe that up to that first year, understands and learns and builds in their own knowledge, in the ma'rifah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them the ability to be receptive to by means of observing that which is around them. As the child gets older, it begins to play, or what we consider to be play. Children, of course, they love toys. If I were to pivot my camera to the left or to the right or behind me, you're going to see toys all around me. Why? Because children, again, they enjoy playing. And through our lens, we believe that the children or that the child just enjoys being playful because children themselves are just playful. But in reality, as many psychologists, they demonstrate that when a child is playful, that's actually their means of seeking knowledge. When a child is playing with a toy, when a child is breaking a toy, when a child is smashing something against the wall, we might not appreciate that. But at the end of the day, that's their method toward uncovering some sense of truth because they're seeking some sense of knowledge. We ourselves seek knowledge in many different ways. But many a times, our door and our capacity to seek knowledge was closed at a very young age. Maybe because we weren't given that much opportunity to play, for instance. If you take a look, for instance, you go to the mosque or even in your own household, and I'm guilty of this perhaps more than anyone else, that if our children are awfully playful, sometimes we think, man, like, what wrong did I do with my child? My child really is shaitan by the way that they're running across, they're breaking things, they're so loud, or they're so disruptive, and they're so annoying, and so on and so forth. That's not the case. And sometimes when you take a look at a child who's sitting quietly and so well behaved, we think, oh man, this child, this is exactly the type of child that I wish that I gave birth to. But in reality, again, every child develops and grows differently. Just one quick anecdote. My nephew, a couple of days ago, he was in Majlis for Imam Hussain, not mine. Nonetheless, I forgive them. They were sitting in a Majlis for Imam Hussain, and the Sheikh was giving the lecture. And he mentioned that we as a community need to shake it up when it comes to our akhlaq, meaning that we need to start making sure that we're becoming a little bit more merciful, a little bit more compassionate. My nephew, who's approximately 3 years old, he got up in the middle of the Majlis, started dancing. And everyone's like, what's going on over here? He heard shake it up, and he thought that he should be dancing. Of course, we as parents, community, elders are going to be like, what's going on with this child? Again, what's wrong with him? But at that innate nature of the child is to play, is to move. And it understands itself and it understands its environment via methods of play. And that brings me then to the third method when children become older, by which they're able to seek knowledge and learn. And that is, again, via experience and making connections. Simple example, that oftentimes a child at a very young age, 2, 3, 4 years old, is of course attached to their mother, is of course attached to their father, but undoubtedly their mother more so. And the minute that their mother begins to get ready to leave the home, even if they haven't said anything about them going out, they see the way that their mother dresses and they know that they're going to leave. And the child begins to cry. The child begins to scream. Even at a very young age, when they're only a couple of months old. The mom wears hijab, is about to exit the door, And all of a sudden, screaming. Why? Because they know that just by the way that just by the way that their mother, or just by the way that their father, just by the way that their friend has dressed, that in a little while, they're no longer going to be in their presence. And emotionally, their state gets sort of turned upside down. Similarly, a child is built by routine. When you want to teach a child to sleep adequately, appropriately, you begin by shutting off the lights. You begin by creating some sense of routine, taking them to the restroom, brushing their teeth, whatever it might be. And the minute that something like daylight savings takes place and the sun is out a little bit longer than it was before, the child doesn't want to go to sleep. Why? Because it says, look, there's light outside. Because again, we associate from a very young age experiences and routine and symbolism to the way that we learn, the way that we develop, the way that we understand certain things. In a fourth stage, when a child becomes of a certain age, maybe 4 and above, the child begins to associate and seek knowledge by means of language. From a very, very young age, before it's able to speak and code via the language that you and I collectively we speak, they come up with their own term for milk, their own term for water, their own term for using the bathroom, their own term for sleeping, oftentimes their own term for mother or for father or for whatever. But as they get older, they're able to pick and choose the appropriate language to identify, for instance, what is water or what is milk or what is phone, because of repetition, because of hearing that from their parents. Again, I say all of this not to give you all a lesson in parenting, because at the end of the day, I need that more than anyone else, but really in order for us to understand a common thread amongst every single one of these 4 patterns of seeking knowledge of a child from a very young age. And that is that every single one of them have to deal with physical forms or have to deal with things that can be understood via a child's senses. They play and they touch and they taste and they see. Again, all of these are in regards to the 5 senses of the human being. When it comes toward questions like that about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how can we engage our children in terms of teaching them how they can understand God when we know, of course, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot be understood by any of these 5 senses? لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ, that there is nothing like him. He cannot be seen, nor can he be heard, nor can he be tasted, nor can he be smelt, nor can he be touched. Yet over here, we perhaps run into a problem. Because many a time, immediately, the parent is more inclined toward getting the child to understand the problem of their question. For instance, who created Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? You ask your child, who created you? And your child says, Allah, because you taught them. But the next question that they might ask is, then who created Allah? And then what are we going to do? We're stuck. If we don't answer the question appropriately, or if we seek toward dismissing their question, or we seek toward explaining it to them in a way that goes beyond the physical senses that they're understanding. Of course, these questions have to be answered in a way whereby the child is able to have the capacity to understand. And they're probably not going to be asking these questions at age 2 or 3 anyway, but at a later age. So it's about getting them to a state whereby they're able to be receptive. We'll get into that in just a moment. And this brings me then toward the second dimension of my discussion with regards to a couple of problematic methods in terms of the way that we engage or teach our children. And let me just say this again in one quick parenthesis. And that is that, like I said, it's awfully difficult to raise children. And it's awfully difficult toward teaching them how to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I'm not claiming to be any expert. I'm claiming to be someone who is learning, and hopefully we're able to sort of share in this process so that we're able to cultivate a environment of God-conscious children, inshallah ta'ala. So what are some of these bad methods that are often employed within our households, within our communities, with regards to teaching our children? Number one is, of course, by ignoring their questions entirely. Eventually, a child gets to a state whereby they're consistently asking why questions. Why is the sky blue? Why are you wearing black? Why is my skin this color? Why did you buy this and not that? Why is anything and everything that they have to speak to, every thought that comes to their mind, they always jump to why. Why do we have to do it like this? Why don't they do it like this? So on and so forth. Why questions for a child, again, are innate. Every single one of us during the course of our lives have been there, where we have asked our parents, we've asked those around us these questions numerous times. And like Socrates famously states, a life that is not questioned is not worth living. The idea is that in life, we consistently, from a very young age, ask these why questions. But that door gets shut really, really quickly. Because oftentimes we're the one shutting it for our children, because we ourselves didn't have that opportunity to ask ourselves. And in a famous quote also from Picasso, the famous artist, who says every child is an artist, but the problem is how to remain an artist once we grow up. Again, we have that curiosity from a really young age, but by culture and by society, again, we're forced to retreat and keep that curiosity to ourselves. And as a famous child psychologist states, every child is a philosopher until we lock them up in the prison of non-questioning. Again, and so again, sort of the teachings of the Prophet and his family, alayhim salatu wasalam, which actually encourage this idea of seeking evidences to everything. If you go ahead and take a look at a book like Kitab al-Kafi of Al-Kulayni, whereby he narrates all of these ahadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, you open up the first chapter, the book of intellect and the book of Tawheed thereafter, and you're going to see that the narrations that are presented, so many of them, are these conversations that Imam as-Sadiq alayhi salam has with many atheists during his day in the holy city of Medina, and whenever he would go for Hajj in Mecca. He would interact with them. He wouldn't get angry. He wouldn't reject their questions. In fact, he would sit with them for hours upon hours, answering those questions, to the extent that he trained some of his companions, like individuals like that of Hisham ibn Hakam, to go and speak toward these points and toward these realities, and to converse again with individuals who didn't believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Again, not in a way that only engaged polemics, but in a way whereby they really sincerely wanted to impart wisdom upon those who were seeking knowledge. And yet for our children, it's so easy for us to completely ignore their questions, or to pivot away from them, or to not answer them, or so on and so forth. So number one, the biggest problem, or amongst the biggest problems or methods that we often employ in terms of engaging our children, is by ignoring their questions entirely. A second sort of poor method in terms of engaging our children is answering them, but not answering them adequately. We often like to sort of run away from these questions. And again, how many of us have ever thought of the questions that our children ask? A child, for instance, will come to their parent and not only ask them who created Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because it's a question that we may have all asked, but they'll ask questions like, where is Allah? Where is God? And we can come up with really nice, eloquent answers, like maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in our heart, or for whatever reason, that we often state that, for instance, Allah is everywhere. I remember one child, when they were told that Allah is everywhere, they asked, is also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the toilet? So every time the toilet flushes, part of Allah also goes in there. So again, it's problematic that we explain to our kids, again, in ways that we think that might make sense, but oftentimes they're a lot more creative and a lot more clever than many of us. So it's important, again, that we find the answers and that we dig deep down towards seeking appropriate answers in terms of engaging our children. Because if we're giving them answers that are not adequate, if we're giving them poor answers and they're not satisfied by those answers, where are they going to go? Eventually, they're going to get to an age where they have a smartphone in front of them and they're going to look it up online and they're going to find something